Hello, in this video lecture, I'd like to introduce you to the chapter of culture and communication. For in terms of what you need to know for the class, it's important to understand that the word culture by itself, according to Edward T. Hall, the word culture comes from the Latin root agriculture, and it means to cultivate. The word culture means agriculture because it has to do with all the morals, values, beliefs, attitudes that are passed down from one generation to the next. In other words, these are the items that have been cultivated from your parents and passed down to you, which will be passed down to the next generation. It is also important to know that there are two major categories that Edward T. Hall was able to classify culture into, and these are what constitutes high context culture and low context culture. The reason I'm explaining these two different categories is because we need to be aware that every organization, every company has a culture, and within that culture, there are certain rules or norms that in which you will be able to describe what type of culture they apply to specifically. When when you divide the word culture into two categories, with the high context culture versus low context culture, you can or one way to tell the difference between the two is that a high context culture is a type of organization or the type of society that likes to or prefers to communicate through nonverbal communication. A lot of what they say, a lot of their messages are passed around through nonverbal communication versus a low context culture where there is a preference for verbal communication and everything is preferred when it is explained and explicit. A high context culture is also one that has been around for a long period of time, and their structure has been set up and it works for the people that participate in this organization or society, and norms, rules are difficult to change versus a low context culture where they because it's a newer type of society or a newer type of organization, they seem to uh, always be evolving and always trying to uh, come up with a new way of organizing their structure. So uh, here are some of the categories that you're bound to see when you're looking at a high context culture. A high context culture can be number one, polychronic. Polychronic means that they have different ways of looking at time. And so, because the word poly comes from the Greek and it means several, and chronos means time, therefore, different perceptions of time. There are also what is called a masculine culture, and that means that gender roles are specific and formal. They are also what is called a collectivistic type of society, and in this case, it means that people who live in this type of societies or in this type of organizations, they work for the benefit of the group rather than the individual. They're also what they're called high power distance. In a high power distance type of society or organization, the people that are at the top seem to have control or most control over the way business is done, or even the economy or the finances are distributed amongst the majority of it is distributed amongst the very few people, and the majority are basically in the general population are not as wealthy. They are also a low avoidance of uncertainty, and what that means is that because people have grown up with being polychronic, collectivistic, they are masculine and a high power distance. They always also seem to be low avoidance of uncertainty, and that means that these are the type of people that like to go with the flow. Their lives are not necessarily very structured, and we have this figure of expression where we say that people know how to roll with the punches. They don't have to follow a certain structure. They don't have to live on a schedule. They're very easygoing. And so examples of a high context culture can be, if we were talking about a country, you could say, for example, Mexico or Spain or China or India. If you consider those, this type of society has been around for a very long time, and they seem to be able to work the way that they work and the way that society is structured. It works for them. So they're not always trying to evolve or always trying to change the way they do things. Now let's talk about a low context culture. A low context culture is one that is somewhat new. In this case, for example, the United States of America, we say that we are a low context culture because we are a newer society as compared to, say, Mexico, India, or China. And the patterns that you see that are the contrast with the high context culture is that they are monochronic, they are individualistic, they are a feminine type of society, they are a low power distance, and they are a high avoidance of uncertainty. So therefore, if they're monochronic, that means that we have one idea and one perception of time. And we also, because we're the kind of society that likes to work on schedules, and we seem to not do well when we don't go by those schedules. Everything is very structured and not necessarily flexible. Then we are also individualistic. We seem to seek the success of the individual rather than a high context culture, which is collectivistic and they work for the benefit of the group rather than the individual. We're also a feminine type of culture where we say that we promote equality. Women's rights are important, and we promote the idea that men and women are equal. And even if we're not, we still promote that idea that men and women, there's more of an equality in the way we treat each other. For that, if you think about an example in China, for many years they had this sort of a law where couples could only, not that they could only have one child, but they had this policy to where it was best if you only had one child. My understanding is that if you had more than one child, which people could or couples could, but they will be taxed beyond having more than one child. And with that said, it is believed that this is not a rule that is written anywhere, but society's perception is that people in China would rather have a boy than a girl. There is also, so we're talking about how they are individualistic, they are monochronic, they are a feminine type of society, and they are a low power distance. That means that the way society is structured, the wealth is divided more equally amongst the, basically amongst society. I know that we have a lot of people that are poor in the United States, but compared to those countries, there's a big difference because even though we have a lot of people that are wealthy in the United States, our middle class is very large, and our lower class is not as prominent as it is in a high context culture. Finally, there is a high avoidance of uncertainty. That means that because we live in such a structured society, then we don't like for things to not go our way. We are very inflexible, so we tend to want to try to keep everything in a way that is always meeting our expectations. To make that point, I would even say that to see if you can understand this better, in a low context culture, we are the type of society where we say that we are service oriented, versus in a high context culture is buyer beware. If you have seen, for example, in the United States, we say that the customer is always right, and we have developed this sense of I'm always right as a customer, and I should get exactly what I need, exactly how I want it, exactly how I expected it. Versus, say, in Mexico or in Spain or in China, the majority of the time is buyer beware. Okay, so I hope that this makes sense for the lecture. Remember that a high context culture is one that is polychronic, collectivistic, masculine, high power distance, and low avoidance of uncertainty. A low context culture is one that is monochronic, individualistic, feminine, low power distance, and high avoidance of uncertainty. If you're looking for more information, you can always look up these terms online, and you're going to be able to get a little bit more of an idea as well as examples as to how they work and what they mean. Until next time, we'll see you soon.